I forgot to sort of say a few things. Probably the most important was, comme j'ai dit mercredi, jeudi, et comme vous avez remarqué, les présentations sont faites en anglais, mais s'il y a des personnes qui veulent des traductions ou si vous avez des questions en français, je suis tout à fait prête à répondre à vos questions en français ou des explications en français. Et voilà. Mais je regrette que les présentations sont tous en anglais. What we are doing now is talking about the international connections. Now, ReSDA is an international project, and some of you may have noted that we have a lot of international researchers involved in our project. But at the very beginning, we noted that it was probably wise for us to, in our actual research, concentrate on developing ReSDA-sponsored projects that looked at Canada. And so we leaned on various partnerships to develop other aspects of ReSDA that we felt were important for the ReSDA research, but that we didn't have perhaps as much capacity to deal with. And one of the first projects that was what's become known as Arctic Frost. When ReSDA first started, from the first year, Anna Kurtula, who works for the National Science Foundation, she's the head of Arctic Social Science funding for the National Science Foundation. When ReSDA was funded by SSHRC, she found out about it and she came to us and said, look, you know, this is a great idea and it would be great if we had some sort of a complementary project in the United States. And so she asked Andrey and others to put together a project that dealt with many of the similar issues as ReSDA. Anna is from Alaska, from a well-known Alaskan family, and so the issue of resource development and Arctic communities was very dear to her. Andrey was able to put together a project with a number of people, which resulted in Arctic Frost. And from the very beginning, we did this in a sort of a concerted organization of work. That Arctic Frost would be the vehicle through which the ideas of sustainability would be developed. Now, ReSDA is dealing with resource development and sustainability in the Arctic. It was decided that the issues, the complex issues around, especially community notions of sustainability, which I think was pointed out, that different communities have their own notions of sustainability. That would be the job of Arctic Frost in the ReSDA project. And so Arctic Frost has been developing then this notion of sustainability. We've had several workshops across the world with communities to develop different notions of sustainability. And Andrey has given us an overhead that Lee, I'll ask Lee, you to come and go through.
This should be brief. Andrey is still young enough to at least think he can go to 2 meetings in 2 days on 2 continents and contribute. So he's not here. So let me just run through his slides. I'll kind of be like the tour bus driver in those Alaska tours. You know, hey, a bear. You know, I won't go through every slide. I'll just point out some of the highlights. So. That's the steering committee. Steering committee is half residents of the United States, half people from the rest of the world. So it's a pretty diverse steering committee. And it also means we don't get together a lot because it's expensive to bring everybody together. Frost, Terry never explained where the mineral comes from, but Frost, it comes from frontiers of sustain. So you can see how he gets the name Frost, kind of tortured there. But it's a research coordination network sponsored by NSF. And the point of the research coordination networks, and this is with, like Chris said, the funding is focuses on sustainability. And the other part of this for academics is for NSF, it's an interdisciplinary focus as well. So we get those two. So the main purpose of FROSS is to build these collaboration networks that are both interdisciplinary and international and focus on sustainability. It's established in the Arctic village of Cedar Falls, Iowa. So that's the center. Here's the objectives of the project. Most importantly, I think, is since number one is accomplish some synthesis of what we know about sustainability. And that's one of the things that I'm realizing as we sit in this meeting. That, you know, there's a lot of stuff that people are doing, going on in a lot of different places. And one of the things that hopefully this project does is bring the knowledge together in a place where it can be accessible for a lot of people. And that, of course, like the knowledge gap studies that ReSDA started out with, will give us some direction for the future. People join Arctic Frost. It's mostly young people, but it's spread around in a lot of different places. This is what we do. Things that I think differ are, in my experience with working with this sort of stuff, is things that we do are there's a focus in Arctic Frost on community meetings. That's both on the distribution. We had a meeting in Iowa, in Cedar Falls, and the purpose was to tell people in the Midwest that, you know, there sure are people up in the north. There to tell them about Arctic issues and Arctic problems and Arctic opportunities. We've done something like that at the University of Minnesota in Duluth as well. So there's that kind of get the word out part. And then there's a focus also on community meetings to get the word in. So we've had meetings in northern Canada with ReSDA and in Nome with ReSDA, and one in Russia. Did you guys sponsor? Yeah, that one. So there's been these joint community meetings to hear what the people of the communities are interested in. Arctic Frost also has, I think this is NSF, they also have an interest in K-12, getting the word out, putting education, sustainability in the Arctic kind of education to teachers and students in K-12. One of the things that I'm most excited about with Arctic Frost is there's a real focus on entertaining young scholars, early career scholars. And so every year there's a meeting, and often it was in St. Petersburg, in Vienna, and in Anchorage, to where we bring young scholars together to try to give people who are completing their PhDs or early in their academic careers, give them an interest in the North, study in the North, which I think is a pretty cool idea. In fact, Arctic Frost has begun calling them fellows. So these early career scholars become kind of a network of its own right in Arctic Frost. And then we have there's the bear. Yeah, see, these are just pictures of things that have been done. Cedar Falls, that's Cedar Falls in the upper left-hand corner there. There aren't really any falls in Cedar Falls that I saw. I don't know why it got its name. And some of the activities, Arctic Frost was an important player in this Arctic Horizons process that NSF is running to try to figure out what the next research questions are. That was important, useful. The Arctic Frost participates has sessions in academic, like the one in the lower right-hand corner there. They're giving Fran Ulmer, who was a lieutenant governor of Alaska and now heads Arctic research. What is she? Arctic?
U.S. Arctic Research.
Yeah, U.S. Arctic Research Commissioner, make her Arctic Scholar for the day, or gave her some sort of award. And then we have these meetings in rural communities to find out what people have to say. This is all on the website, so I'm going to go through this point by point. The first point, no, you can get. But what these are what the communities, what our interpretation or Andrey's interpretation of what the people from the communities had to say about what things they thought were important. This is on the Arctic Frost website. We gave a lecture and And they had another meeting in Russia with indigenous communities and some of the main points that were taken away. I don't want to, the main points, you can, like I said, go to the Arctic Frost website and you can find out what the people in the communities thought we should be thinking about in the future. We're in the process now of pulling together a book on synthesizing the knowledge about sustainability in the north, and some other things there that you can see we've done. And that's it. Thanks.
We've been working on the issues of resource development in Arctic areas for, well, I guess we could say that we started in 2009 as a team, which would later become ReSDA. In Alaska, the Institute for Socioeconomic Research at the University of Alaska Anchorage has been working on these questions for many years, and they have fascinating research that we are using in our own research now that they've developed over the years. And so as a small taste of the research that's being done at ISER, we're lucky to have Matt Berman, economist at ISER, talk about the research that he's been doing with the Alaska Permanent Fund and its impact on poverty in Alaska. Yeah.
Can I just say something to the Arctic Frost?
Oh, sure. Susa from Arctic Frost.
There's an idea with board yesterday that we could have a Arctic Frost next year sometime, where we get together building career scholars and from communities and talk about topics that are of interest for communities to research on. So if any of you is interested in that, you can just kind of talk to me or give me your email or something, and then once we've been just, like this idea was just born last night, so with Jen, Joe, so we'll just keep you posted if anything, yeah, to go along with it.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'd like to talk briefly about one of the research projects that's actually sponsored by Anna Kurtula's program, NSF. It's called SIRAC, which is a little easier acronym to swallow because it's Social Indicators for Rural Alaska Communities. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborator on this particular part of that research. It was Random Remy, who's a young Yupik man from rural Alaska, from Dillingham. As a First Alaskans Institute intern this summer and did a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about. So I talk about the Permanent Fund Dividend. And so first, for those who are not familiar with it, the Alaska Permanent Fund is really a sovereign wealth fund for the state of Alaska. And the state constitution has a strict prohibition against dedicated funds. So to establish a permanent fund, it required a constitutional amendment, which was passed by referendum in 1976. And from the very beginning, there was sort of a debate about whether the fund should be managed for as an investment fund or true sovereign wealth fund, or whether it should be invested in economic development like the Alberta Heritage Fund was. And Governor Jay Hammond had this brilliant idea to sort of to defend the principle of the fund. We should get the people have a direct stake in it by distributing the earnings to the fund directly to the people. And so that was how the Permanent Fund Dividend program got started. So half the earnings of the fund are annually distributed to people in the form of dividends, and the other half are returned to the fund to maintain the principal. So that program succeeded very well, and today the Permanent Fund has about $55 billion in assets. It seems modest, but when you compare it to the size of the population of Alaska, it's about $75,000 or $80,000 US or $100,000 Canadian per person. So it's a substantial amount of money. And now, since Alaska's an oil state and the oil revenues are going away, it's come to the time where the Permanent Fund is we have to think about using the earnings for funding state government, which was the original purpose, to save the revenues. And so the era of the permanent fund dividend may be winding down, and so it's an appropriate time to evaluate this program, which has been a remarkable program over the past 25 years. So it's a unique social experiment. It's sort of an experiment in basic income. The dividends are given out equally per person for everybody who's lived in Alaska for a year or more. And I just want to look at one question about, there have been a lot of questions about it, but one of them that really hasn't been discussed is its effect on poverty. I know, the issues of poverty is obviously only, it's an artificial measure, but it is a very important measure of income. It's sort of a very simple measure of income disparity, and especially lower income people. So the question is, what would be the effect of reducing or eliminating the permanent fund dividends on poverty in Alaska? So just to give you an idea of the size of the permanent fund dividends, you see that the dividends there change year to year based on a sort of an average of historical earnings of the fund. So they bounce around quite a bit. These are the earnings of the fund. So the dividends are variable as well. And it's sort of between 3 to 5 or 6% of personal income. So it's fairly modest, but it's still substantial. It's still substantial. So to talk about poverty, now poverty is an artificial, an imperfect measure, and in the United States, the Census Bureau defines poverty as a set of, it's based on the family living together in one household, and there's 47 different poverty thresholds depending on how many adults and how many children there are. So it's very complicated. It changes every year for general inflation. It has it has one particular flaw that has bothered people in Alaska. It has no adjustment for regional differences in cost of living. So especially in rural Alaska, where cost of living is probably 50% higher than it is nationally, there's no adjustment. So there's just one poverty level for the nation. And you see that it does, it's quite complicated. But even so, we thought, well, maybe we could just look at the effect on income, and it would be easy to assess the effect on poverty. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And basically, the census is the only source of information that really has the detailed income for which we could do this. The census is also the only source of data on the Alaska Native population, where you can distinguish native from non-native people. And income is self-reported, and the permanent fund dividend is in the census only to the extent that people report it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of problems with that. In particular, not everybody reports the dividend because the census is done with a survey. It's asked during the summer. People get the dividends late in the year, like I just got mine last week. And so they won't, unless they're prompted, they might not remember they're supposed to report their dividend from last year as their income in the past 12 months. And then the bigger problem is that no income is asked at all on children under 15. And of course, children are receiving the dividends. So we want to investigate, well, to what extent is this actually reported in the census data? The answer is not very well. In fact, 30% of households report no income that's unearned, which obviously is wrong because 90% of more than 90% of households receive permanent fund dividends. And they asked the Census Bureau and said, well, they're supposed to report it on their, the adults are supposed to report, their parents are supposed to report their children's income on their income. So we checked to see if that was the case. And in fact, no, sorry, it's not the case. There's no correlation between the number of children in your household and the income, unearned income that you have. So obviously they're not reporting it. So in addition, since they're not reporting income of children, we said, oh, they're also not reporting dividends from Alaska Native Alaska Native corporations that are shareholders, because that's unearned income. And if they're not reporting, so it's probably not being reported there, at least for children. And so these are dividends that are paid by Alaska regional corporations. Some of them are quite substantial, like $5,000 per person. And if you look at the corporations that have enrolled descendants, so that the children are enrolled at birth. There's actually 3 of them that pay significant dividends to children under 15, and these numbers are also not there in the census data. Especially Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, where it's like $5,000 per person. It's like unbelievable how far off those census numbers probably are. Unfortunately, we have a project. Our project, we're going to try to identify that, but that requires looking at the individual census returns in detail. So I can't report on that yet, but I can talk about the permanent fund. So what we did was we took the public use sample, which is a sample of households. We went through each record and figured out an algorithm for identifying where the permanent fund dividends would be reported, if they were reported. And then we took them out. And then we looked at income without the permanent fund dividend. And then we added the permanent fund back in to the people who were eligible to receive it, not the people who reported, people who were eligible to receive it, because like 95% of the people who were eligible to receive it actually did receive it. And then we look at recalculate the poverty with the formula from the census, all 47 different households, and calculate the new poverty. And we even checked our calculations with the reported income against the Census Bureau's calculation of poverty to make sure we had done it right. It took some doing, but Random was very good. I'm really impressed. He was actually an undergraduate when he did this work this summer, and it was his sort of internship for his last course to get his bachelor's degree. So what are the results about poverty? Well, here are the statistics about poverty from the officially reported numbers, and it shows all the way back to 1990. We have the census numbers and then the American Community Survey annually since then. And you'll see that it's strongly regionally, there are big regional disparities. Poverty levels in urban areas are maybe 5 to 8%, and in rural Alaska, they're around 20%. If you look at Alaska Native poverty rates are about 20% too, and non-Native is very much lower. So there's strong regional and ethnic disparities there. And here, just looking at Alaska Native people, American Indian Alaska Native people, it shows the regional disparities. The poverty rates in rural Alaska are about double what they are in urban Alaska for Alaska Native people. And remember, these rural Alaska poverty rates are not adjusted upward for the higher cost of living, so the disparity is even greater than it looks. Although rural people are getting country food, which is not included in the census income. So we don't really know. All we know is that the official rates are much higher in rural Alaska. So we did this calculation. It was a very messy thing, but we think we got it now. And so what is the answer about what's the effect of permanent fund dividends on poverty? So here's this is everybody in the state average, and the blue bars are the bars. That's what poverty rates would be with no permanent fund dividend program at all, as we calculate it. And no, sorry, the top bar. The blue bar is with the permanent fund dividend as we calculate they actually received it. The top bar is the poverty rate without it, and the bar in the middle is the official rate. And you'll see that they've got about half. The census gets about half of the true effect of the permanent fund dividend. But the true effect that we estimate is about 2% of the population is taken out of poverty. So it reduces poverty statewide from like 11% to 9%. And one of the things that you notice there, that the permanent fund dividends effect to ameliorate poverty is actually declining over time. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's urban Alaska. Just briefly, you see the poverty rates are much lower, and rural Alaska, poverty rates are higher, but it's the same general pattern. So I'll go quickly through that. So looking at Alaska Native people now in particular, this is the different bars for different regions. You see that one of the things that's really interesting here is that this is without, if no permanent fund. So this is the income that has no permanent fund. We've removed it. And you'll see that in urban Alaska, poverty among Alaska Native people has been declining. It's basically better education, more jobs, sort of an example but in rural Alaska, there's been no change. It's been sort of stable at very high poverty level without permanent fund dividends. This is basically what it would be if we didn't have this program, and what's quite likely to be in the future when the dividends are very small, if they're still around at all. And here's the effect, when we reconstruct the official poverty rate with the permanent fund dividends, we estimate what it should be. And you see that it's quite a bit lower. It does a pretty good job, although in the past 5 years, and I've averaged them because this is based on a sample, and I want to make sure the sample is not there's not too much sampling error there. It looks like the permanent fund dividend is a much worse, much less effect here. And I try to investigate, well, why is that? And well, it's part of the reason is because the way that the census defines poverty is the official family, so unmarried partners are not counted as family. So we went and identified the unmarried partners and said, okay, what if we include them in the family and redid the poverty rate with it? And actually, it makes a big difference, and sure enough, there's now no trend. So it does show, though, still that the strong regional differentials and the really large effect of the permanent fund dividend on Alaska Native rural poverty. So it's really a large effect. So I just to summarize the conclusions that we got from this. Overall in the state, like somewhere between 15 and 25,000 people are not poor officially because of the dividend. If they remove it, that's about 2% of the population. And for Alaska Natives, it's a much bigger effect, especially it's like 25%. And for rural Alaskans, it's probably even more than that. So it has a substantial effect. And this year, the governor, just to try to balance our huge budget, vetoed half the permanent fund dividend. So he took out $1,000 from the $2,000 dividend, and we estimate that itself has 2% more people in poverty because of it. So there are these real trade-offs. And also, just as a comment, unless the census really changes the way they do it, we'll never see that rise in the poverty rates because the census isn't reporting the permanent fund dividend enough for us to tell when it goes down how it's going to affect poverty. And just like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation and First Alaska Institute for supporting this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm sure people will have questions about that, who can talk to you later on. Now I'd like to introduce Natalia Loukacheva, who's a Canada Research Chair from the University of Northern British Columbia. Natalia has been our our legal counsel, I guess I'd call her, for ReSDA. Whenever we need a legal expert to do work for us or to help us looking at some of our research questions, Natalia's always there. She even went once for ReSDA to Duluth, Minnesota, which is above and beyond the call of duty. And so I'll bring up Natalia to talk a bit about the work that she's doing. She's also represents the University of the Arctic Thematic Network on legal institutions.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here again and see so many colleagues and friends. I'll try to be brief, but since I'm supposed to say something about the network, I'll just mention that it's one of many networks which exists under the auspices of the University of the Arctic. And this specific network includes more than 60 people, mainly lawyers, law professors or PhD students in law. And it was established in 2011, and one of our objectives was to enhance cooperation and collaboration among legal experts, especially those who work in Arctic or Northern issues. And in terms of structure, the network is managed by the Northern Institute of Environmental and Minority Law, University of Lapland, and until last year we had several subgroups. A subgroup on indigenous law, which actually looked at what the question was about alternative dispute resolution and all kind of forms of justice. There is extensive research going on this. Another subgroup looked at oil and gas legislation and mineral legislation in the Arctic. There was a subgroup on Arctic governance, which looked at practically everything. And last year there was a new group on philosophy of law in the Arctic. And again, in my view, it's mainly legal anthropology, but there were some people enthusiastic about this topic. But then we realized that there is a lot of overlapping and similar questions that subgroups can address. That's why now we have general thematic network with a steering committee. And what we do is attached to all kinds of conferences. For instance, there is an annual polar law symposium. Next one will be in Finland next November. And there are also activities which are not produced exactly by the network, but since collaborators are members of this network, so we all share this knowledge. And for instance, there is something what is called the Yearbook of Polar Law, which was established in 2008, and it is published by April. There is a journal, a peer-reviewed journal called Arctic Review on Law and Politics, which is based in Norway. It's an open access journal, and there you can find, and so as in the yearbook, you can find quite many articles which deal with resource development in the north and all kinds of legal issues, especially, well, since it's based in Norway, we accept a lot of submissions on fisheries, but also on indigenous people's rights and minerals. So if you have any interest, you can certainly look at those specialized publications which mainly deal with legal issues. In terms of my own work, I have been working on legal issues in the Arctic for 20 years, and I was fortunate to take part in quite many projects which deal with all kinds of issues in the Arctic, and many of those projects happen to be multidisciplinary projects. And it was clear that until recently there was a huge gap in building the bridge and nexus between legal scholars and scholars in social sciences and humanities, like not only international relations or political science or policy or public policy studies, but other studies. But luckily now this gap has been addressed because there are many events which engage multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinary approaches. And more specifically, with regards to ReSDA, I think I could mention some specialized publications which were sponsored by the Nordic Council of Ministers. There were 3 books. One is called Polar Textbook, came out in 2010. Polar Textbook 2 came out in 2013. And last year there was a book called Polar Law and Resources. So in all those 3 books, I happen to be the project leader and editor, but in all those 3 books, we have a team effort of international, mainly legal scholars looking at all kinds of issues, including issues associated with both renewable and non-renewable resources. So, for instance, in Polar Law and Resources book, we have chapters on whaling in the Arctic, sealing in the Arctic, fisheries in the Arctic, energy policy and climate change in the Arctic. Before that, we had specialized chapters on mineral legal regimes in the Arctic, etc. So there is a long list. And the hope with this kind of work was that we could disseminate this knowledge to remote areas. You can download those books for free at the website of the Nordic Council of Ministers. But one question which I specifically was interested in was to see how we often assume that extractive industries, well, we often assume some stereotypes, for instance, that extractive industries are not always good, but renewables are good. But if you look globally, for instance, even in Europe, where there is a strong emphasis on renewables, there is also a lot of emphasis on state funding and subsidies to have those renewables in place. So if you look in Arctic context, the situation is very diverse, and I think it's very important to find the right balance and see what can be learned from negative or positive experiences from extractive industries versus renewables. That's why ReSDA will focus on renewables a lot at next stage, but I think it's a crucial issue to be addressed because it's never black and white. And even within the Arctic, in many cases, those non-renewables are not always possible. So now I'll just mention some projects that I've been doing this year. The first one has been in collaboration with my colleagues from Aarhus University. It's called Understanding Good Governance, Transparency in the Arctic, the case of Greenland. More specifically, my colleagues wanted to focus on the role of public participation and consultation in resource development projects which deal with oil and gas. There is no oil and gas in Greenland yet, but there are big hopes for offshore oil and gas. But still there is this understanding that people need to be prepared for possible challenges and opportunities that it may bring. And in that respect, there are all kinds of questions with what is called impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, strategic environmental impact assessment. Sometimes it's called social impact assessments or health impact assessments. So I specifically look at what do we mean by good governance in the Arctic context, and would more transparency mean better and efficient procedures for ensuring that communities are advised or consulted on this kind of resource development perspectives. And it turns out that if you look at literature on that, there is a lot of literature and expectations that we need good governance, and there is no rigid definition or understanding what the good governance is. There are certain principles or even legal principles, but they are in a way aspirational principles, and in many ways it's linked to this notion of sustainability. Would good governance bring more sustainability, and all kinds of other questions. And the same can be asked about transparency. It's very important to mention we need to be more transparent. But if you look at the pillars of good governance, they are about legitimacy, transparency, and accountability. And it turns out it's very hard to achieve in the Arctic context. And Finland is a good example of how those challenges are in place. And the second topic that I've been working on is called food security in the Arctic. More specifically, I looked at the case of Nunavut and discovered actually that this question of food security is connected to a complex array of other issues. Some of them are very much linked to resources. And first of all, it's connected to the matter of human rights and indigenous people's rights, since we deal with the territory where the majority of the population are indigenous people. But when it comes to the right to food, which is expressed in international law documents, it means that it talks about affordability, accessibility, and availability of food, and it talks about food and nutrition security as well. So then it turns out that it's not about the shortage of food in the north, but it's about the shortage of access to affordable food. And this has been a big issue in case of Nunavut, because food prices for imported food and goods are really outrageous. But again, we cannot generalize it because the Arctic situation is very different. I also found out that this matter of food insecurity is very much connected to social justice, poverty, non-discrimination, and non-equality. And it's not only legal issue, it's also political issue. It can be addressed on a broad scope of cooperation among not just government of Nunavut, NTI, indigenous organizations, but also members of civil society. And finally, there were very interesting links in terms of subsistence economy and harvesting rights of indigenous peoples. It turns out that when I started to look and analyze some cases from Nunavut judiciary, for instance, which dealt with indigenous peoples' harvesting rights, it turns out that inability to hunt, for instance, means a threat to the loss of the entire culture and the entire people and the identity of those people. And that's why the shortage of access to, let's say, country food or harvesting of country food means serious ramifications for communities. So, and there are also many global linkages to this issue, because it has to do with global pressures, not just climate change or pollution, but also impact of environmental movements on what certain groups can hunt or eat. And it's very much connected to the whole discourse in international law as well on quotas for whales, seals, EU ban on trade of products originated from seal hunt, and all kinds of issues. So my point is that I think there are many linkages to ReSDA, and we heard many linkages to indigenous people's rights and intellectual property rights, etc. these 2 days. And no matter where we look, there are some legal connections, but law is not a panacea. I think it's a tool to address some of the challenges, and yeah, it should be considered in
Great.
this way. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natalia. We are, as I pointed out, ReSDA is an international project, and we have good, I think, connections with Alaska and relatively good connections with projects in Russia. A problem at the beginning was relationships with projects in the European North. But somebody who has been working over the past 5 years to sort of develop and relate projects dealing with extractive resource development in the European North is Aileen Espiratu from the Barents Institute at the University of Tromsø, and she held a very interesting workshop in Kirkenes, Norway, right on the Russian border in 2014. And so I'm pleased to have her here today to talk a bit about the work that she has been doing at the Barents Institute dealing with extractives in the European North.
I have a PowerPoint presentation. I need it.
So you just have to where's the first PDF?
Okay.
Or if you can make it larger.
Here? Oh, I'm a Mac person, so I don't. Oh dear. Okay.
You'll have to scroll down.
Oh dear. Should I put it on my thingy?
No, that's good. If you can just do that.
Can I do that? No. Oh dear. Okay, so it's a bit. This is a bit awkward, but what I'm going to do today is to give you a big swath of money in the European North, European High North. The concept of High North, for those of you who've lived or done research in Norway for the last maybe 7 years or so, is a very political term. Norway has an Arctic, but it's on Svalbard. And so they've created this very political term called High North, but I tend to interchange the two, so excuse me for that. But I live on the 69.69 parallel, and my institute is also situated there. So my institute is in Kirkenes, as Chris has suggested, and or has said, and I live in Tromsø, which is sort of on the same parallel. Sorry. For some reason it doesn't format very well on this. I'm a Mac person, as I said, so it just didn't translate very well here. But this is just to give you an idea of where I am and where we are. So for those of you who, and also the regions or places that I'll be talking about. So Kirkenes, Tromsø is where our university is located, and Kiruna I'll mention as well. But I also want to point you to the Kola Peninsula here, which is very, very highly mined, as most of you know, who've done work at all in the Russian context. I'm also very attached to this microphone. Oh, sorry, I tend to jump around. But this is a mapping of what is in the Arctic. I'm sorry, it's not very visible. I'm not sure. Does anybody know how to make
do you
this
have
better?
a Mac?
I do have a Mac, so maybe I should
could just
plug
plug
it
your
in.
yeah, be way better.
Sorry. Intermission. Oh, no.
Who took the adapter? Chris, do you know where
She
the
has an
adapter
adapter,
went?
actually.
Oh, you have one, okay. But we're missing our adapter.
Oh, I didn't take it.
No, not you. No, whoever had it last.
I think that's me.
Keep that for later.
There, isn't that nice? Okay, moving on. So this is where we are in the Arctic. Just to let you know, this is Southern Europe. We're in the northern part of Europe, and again, 69.69 parallel. I'm not sure where that is in the Canadian context. Ellesmere Island, perhaps. So quite far north. But we have this thing called the Gulf winds that come from the Gulf of Mexico, so it's quite temperate. And so when you come to Tromsø, for example, it's called the Paris of the North. Very, very highly developed, very excellent infrastructure. We have 4G internet everywhere in whether it's high north or the Arctic on Svalbard. So it's in terms of infrastructure, it's quite different from the Canadian North that all of you are more familiar with. Again, this is the region that I'll be talking about a little bit. One of the things that the Norwegian state, as well as the Swedish government and the Finnish government have done over the last 5 years is to map its minerals in its northern territories. Norway was very, very much behind in this compared to Sweden, for example, because since about the late 1960s and into the 70s, Norway relied, and still does, heavily on oil and gas development, and most of that, or actually all of that, offshore. And so it never really developed its onshore minerals, except for a few mines in Kirkenes, where our institute is located, and also a little bit further to the south in Mo i Rana, which has since closed down, and did so in the 1970s. So this is where I'll be taking you today, and I'll be doing it very, very quickly. So a little bit of a background as to why there is mining, or why the study of mining, or where the mineral resources has taken place over the last 5 years in this part of the European North. And I'll be talking a little bit about Russia as a comparative to this. And yeah, I'll just keep going. So this is the background, essentially. How many of you have been to the Arctic frontiers in Tromsø? Oh, okay, 1 or 2 or 3. It's our flagship conference that happens at our university. It began in 2007 with this idea that, of course, we are facing climate change. That there will be, as some of the presenters have already suggested, that there will be ice melt and thus a transshipment of goods from Asia to Europe, and also, of course, in the Northwest Passage. So it's also a resource grab. But one of the things that the Norwegian state was really concerned about was the peak oil idea, that oil would eventually run out, and therefore we needed, as a country, to find other sources of revenue, and also geopolitics, and my thing, in fact, is urbanization and industrialization. I'll just, as a segue, suggest that most of my research on mining in the Arctic has been fed off of other projects, such as our Arctic Urban Sustainability Project that ran until 2015, and now a Future North project that ends this year, but then also a project with Andrey Petrov on Arctic sustainability and synthesis. I think that's what it's called, ASUS. And also another project that was funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, that's it, on political economy in the High North. And so this is where we were looking at neoliberalism and how we get beyond that in northern communities. I won't have time, so I've put the conclusion down now. So these are kind of the voices of local politicians as to what they want to see in their neighborhood and around Arctic mining. So they want to be able to have a say in how that is done, essentially. So interestingly, the indigenous voice has not yet become a force in the high north. Although I'll show you in a moment that it is coming to the fore more and more as mining becomes more and more a reality onshore in Norway and in Finland and also in Sweden. But one of the things that the state wants to do is, of course, develop mining in the high north, in the European north, in order for it to be less responsible for the economic development of the high north. So again, this is that neoliberal relationship of the state with the local level of governance. Again, a conclusion is that indigenous interests have to be taken more into consideration as mining operations become more present in the high north in Europe, and there also has to be, and this is something that the Sami Parliament in particular in northern Norway has said, is that there has to be a thick and also community consultation and much more social engagement from corporations who are mining or who are planning to mine in the European high north. Although right now the tensions between mining concerns, especially in Norway, is very, very tense between them and the Sami Parliament in particular. This is the mine that's outside of Kirkenes. This is how it was in 2008, and we took a trip there, but I don't think Chris came, because you were not in the photograph that we took. But this is how it was in 2014 when we had our meeting. So if you track the price of iron ore from 2008 to 2015, that's when the digging became most intense. And this is true for most mining concerns around the world. And so the cheaper it became, the cheaper that iron ore became, the more this mine dug. So they had to mine more in order to get more revenue. And so it's shocking. Let me just. We took a tour of the mine in 2008, and it's a mine that had been in operation for 100 years until 1996. Oh, okay, 90 years until 1996, and then reopened in 2008 and 2009. But within that period of 2008, 2014, it was had remarkably expanded. And this is just a short bit of it. It goes on for kilometers and kilometers for as far as the eye could see. So this is the King's Tribune, where we could take photographs of it. These are the drivers of mining in the high north. So it actually comes from the south, from Europe. Europe was seeing that most of its minerals was coming from outside of the European realm, from Australia or from South America, Brazil, and those places. So what they decided to do in 2008 was to scope out what was in its neighborhood, and it just so happens that what was in its neighborhood was in the Arctic. And so this is one of the major things that precipitated mining strategies in all of the countries that I'm speaking about in the Nordic North. So of course, in the Russian context, mining had been ongoing since the Soviet period. So that was already present. This is how Norway has been mapped over since about 2011 in terms of what it has in terms of mining, and this is our north. I'm going really, really fast now because I'm running out of time. This is a bit of a cheat because this is in Neriungri in Far East Russia, but this is just to give you a taste of mining in Russia. This is a map that I saw when I was an undergraduate student already in the late 1980s. And it shows that Russia had already mapped its minerals as early as the Stalinist period. So mapping in Russia wasn't an issue in terms of the Russians knew what was underneath all that bedrock and sand. So the Kola Peninsula, I'm highlighting the Kola Peninsula here because it is part of the European Arctic, European North. So and really is within the conversation of mining in the European high north. And these are the drivers, of course, of Russian mining, and that includes the revenues apart from oil and gas that the country subsists out of. Some of the same problems that we see in the Canadian North are the same problems that we see in the European North. So one of the things that is really extant is that that regional development is a key driver of mining in the European High North. Again, emerging concerns, more foreign ownership. In fact, the mine outside Linkages was floating on the Australian Stock Exchange until it went bankrupt last year. I forgot to say that the mine is now closed and it's actually just simmering. There's only 50 people working there now in anticipation of a rise in price of iron ore. This shows us how important mining is even in northern Sweden. A mine, Kiruna, has existed for over 100 years, but now they have to move the city in order for it to keep digging because of instability on the ground. But this is being done by LKAB, the mining company, who are incredibly well accepted in this community. I mean, it's a company town, but it is also owned by the state. But more and more, what we're seeing in the European North is opposition to mining. So, of course, leading this are the indigenous populations, the Sami in northern Sweden, the Sami in northern Norway against a copper mine in Kvalsund, the northern part of Norway, and the Sami using techniques such as writing to investors of the mine to say, look, this is something that we have approved. There was no community consultation, but now the conflict is between the state and the mining company who are working together and the Sami interests. But interestingly, in the context of ISER, and it's become a very complicated case and needs further research, is that one of the reindeer herding, they're not families, one of the reindeer herding Vida has actually approved the mining, and it's pitted against another reindeer herding Vida that has not approved the mining. So it's a very complicated case, and the Sami parliament itself is completely against the mining. So we'll see what happens over the next 3 years, or two and a half years, because the mine wants to open by 2019. So we go back to this, and that's it for me, I think, because I've run out of time. Thank you everyone.
I think your points about the Sami's position on mining are very interesting. We had at ICAST, the last ICAST meeting in Prince George, British Columbia. It was interesting to hear the differences in opinions surrounding extractives from the indigenous representatives from Canada, Russia, and Alaska. And the Sami position, which, as was pointed out, is very much tends to be opposed to this sort of development. So that's an interesting thing that we hope to find more about, and hopefully through a new project which has just started. And so the next presentation will be about this new project out of Stockholm, dealing with extractive resource development and sustainability. The leader of the project is Sverker Sorlin. Some of you may know Sverker. He's famous for the book Framtidslandet, which some of you may have read if you read Swedish, I guess. If you don't read Swedish, you probably didn't read it. But he couldn't be here, so we have Dag Avango here to represent ReSDA. ReSDA?
So thank you very much, Chris, for inviting us here to this very interesting workshop, which I really wished I had been able to participate both days. So I will talk about RESDA, which stands for Resource Extraction and Sustainable Arctic Communities. This is a research center made up of several organizations, which I will mention. Myself, I work at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm in a department dealing with history, history of science, history of technology, history of environment. And we also have a new department within our organization called the Environmental Humanities Laboratory. So it's within that sphere that we work. So RECSAC is funded by a funding body connected with the Nordic Council of Ministers called Nordforsk. And my department is leading this center together with the Department for Physical Geography at Stockholm University and the Stockholm Environment Institute. And well, we are taking our point of departure in important processes of change globally that influence the Arctic. Climate change is one obvious, but even more in focus of the work that we do is, of course, global economic changes, and especially the shifting demands for natural resources, in particular mineral resources. This is an image from Kiruna that Aileen showed you earlier, where they are moving entire town. There are several other mining communities in the Scandinavian north and the European north that are affected by those global changes. Yeah. So, what we do with this center is to study extractive industries in different aspects of them, as cultural phenomena, as social, economic, and also ecological phenomena. And we are studying the entire business cycle of mining industry and how these influence the natural environment and the communities. So we are looking at why resource extraction commences, namely the construction of minerals as natural resources, the drivers, the actors. And the second batch of research questions pertains to the consequences of these mining projects for the communities in the Arctic, and also, of course, for the natural environment in their vicinities. And the third one concerns deindustrialization and the transition of mining regions into post-industrial futures and opportunities to create sustainable communities beyond mining projects in the Arctic. I mentioned the core partners. We are having 13 more partners involved in this. So we have Aalborg University in Denmark with Lill Drastad Bjørst, is our lead contact there. Dalarna University is located in Sweden, where we have the Human Geography Department and their tourism-oriented research with Albina Perskevich in the lead. Others are the Luleå Technological University, also located in Sweden, who are doing quite a lot of research pertaining to the mining industry, even supported by the mining industry. We work together with people who are not supported by the mining industry within the field of environmental history there. Dolly Jørgensen is probably known to some of you. Mark Nuttall, who is Canadian, who are involved in several of the networks that have been presented here today. He's representing the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources in our center. We also have the Memorial University of Newfoundland with Arne Keeling, that spoke earlier, and also John Sandloss, Anna Dans, who is not at this institute anymore, as I believe, but she's still on the network. NICU is a Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, who are also involved. Also in Norway, we have the Oslo University, their Department of Anthropology, with Marianne Lien in the lead, but we also cooperate with Britt Kranvid, who I believe is located in Tromsø, at least has work there. SLU is the Swedish Agricultural University, and there we all, just like at Stockholm University, the people who work there are natural scientists within ecology, biology. So it's, as you hear, the center is made up of research environments that are truly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. So we have both humanist and social sciences, of course, but also natural science research, particularly at SLU and Stockholm University. And we are trying our best to integrate those research environments. So in order to avoid having silos with people working in what they usually do, we are trying to integrate the research within those different disciplines by working together in common case study areas, which are marked out on this photo. So it's Western Greenland, which is a region where you have had the mining industry present since basically the 1850s, in some cases even earlier, up until the present. Another region that Aileen talked about earlier is northern Fennoscandia, where you have in Sweden mining going on since the 17th century more or less, but with an expansion in this industry from the 1880s and up until the present, following the boom and bust cycles of the mining industry. And the third region where we look at is Svalbard. Also mentioned previously, we have mining since the 1870s, particularly within coal from the early 1900s up until the present, when, well, we have a deindustrialization process starting up there. Despite research is one thing that we do, but a core activity is also education. We have a PhD program, and we are hiring several PhD students for this project. I'll return to this issue. So, case study areas is one way of integrating the different research groups. Research task is another. So we have several research tasks, 10 of them altogether, that we cooperate from the different universities and the different disciplines involved. First one being led by Joan Nyman Larsen from Anchorage, from the Stephenson Institute there, looking at indicators and assessments that can be used for integrating environmental, social, and economic assessments. The main question that she works on is what sort of indicators that are most useful for decision makers at different levels to understand future and ongoing changes that affect possibilities to create sustainable development in resource-based communities. Another research task is on brings together several natural scientists and also people from anthropology, concerns the multiple impacts of both climate change and extractive industries in the three case study regions that we are working in. Great. I will have to yell, I guess. And the idea is to well, develop new impact assessment methods and that can integrate both these impacts from climate change and from extractive industries, and to provide new best practices and processes for making those more scientifically robust impact assessment, but assessment that are also reflecting the interests of local communities, in particular the indigenous communities in the north. So Ninis Roskvist, who is leading this research task, she works very closely with the Sami communities around Kiruna, the Levas and Girjas Sami villages. Similar setup is run by Mark Nuttall on Greenland. So a third research task deals with governance structures for extractive industries. Here Mark Nuttall is in the lead of this one, together with people from Stockholm University and also Newfoundland who work on this. And it studies and aims to explain the development of resource governance pertaining to mining, and in particular the history of environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment processes, looking at how these governance models have evolved, why they evolved, and how they have changed over time. A fourth one concerns transnational companies and their interaction with indigenous communities. Also, again, here is this is led by Peter Roberts together with Arne Keeling, looking at how and why transnational companies have emerged as actors with responsibilities in regards to local communities in the Arctic, and how these responsibilities have been challenged or accepted in different contexts within the Arctic region, from Canada to Greenland to northern Scandinavia. Effective Economies is led from Copenhagen University by Kirsten Thisted, who is a literary scholar, looks at the influence of local political and cultural movements, particularly in Greenland, and how they influence the way extractive industries behave, both in practice but also in terms of rhetorics and how they market themselves. Again, particularly in case studies related to Greenland here. Rewilding, this is led by Dolly Jørgensen, who is at Luleå Technological University and who studies in particular the post-mining remediation processes. So this relates to some of the research that is done on Newfoundland, mentioned here earlier. And she's looking at, on one hand, this group is looking at the construction of, well, the very idea of what is a pristine environment, and especially the natural original state that mining companies claim that they will bring back the environment to, and how existing expectations for remediation can be considered in order to better serve communities in the Arctic. And related to this is the seventh research task, where we study also post-industrial transitions in Arctic mining communities, but more with a focus on different attempts across the Arctic to reuse different material legacies of mining for new purposes in post-industrial context, for tourism, for instance, mining tourism, industrial heritage, and other forms of reuse. Well, I will not go into the details of all these research remaining research tasks in order to save time, but I will mention scenarios, research task 9, which looks at scenario workshops as a methodological tools to sort out future planning in resource-dependent communities, and the 10th one, which is really a research task that we will all bring in all researchers within ReSDA to engage in towards the end of the project to create synthesis. Right, so all in all, this network brings together about 75 researchers in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, and we are hiring for the funding we have from Nordforsk. We will be hiring 6 PhD students and also some additional PhD students on other funding that has come up as a result of establishing the center. One of those we are hiring was mentioned before here, Jean-Sébastien Boutet, who will move to Stockholm and work together with us and bring in knowledge he has built over the years working here in these networks in Canada. We are also funding about 11 senior researchers, 1 postdoc, and we have also funding for moving both researchers and PhD students around in a mobility program, and of course also funding for outreach activities and conferences and such. The leadership of ReSDA is, as Chris mentioned earlier, it's Sverker Selin, who is the PI, and Gunhild Rosqvist at Stockholm University, Physical Geography, who is the co-PI. I am leading the research school and PhD education, and Annika Nilsson, Stockholm Environment Institute, is in charge of outreach and coordination activities. We also have a larger body making the bigger decisions within the program that consists of all leaders of research tasks and research teams, some of whom I had mentioned before. In terms of timeline, we are of course in the beginning of the project. We received this funding, the news of it earlier this year, and so we are in the process of planning for research and for activities that we will do over the coming years. We are hiring PhD students, as I mentioned. We are in the startup phase when it comes to outreach and communication. So we have built this website where you can learn a lot more what RecSac will be doing. So it's recsac.org. Look it up and you can dig into the different research tasks in more detail. And we post on a regular basis blogs from our different activities. There's information there about the PhD school, which is possible to apply for PhD students who are not within the program, but there's additional place for additional PhD students there if you know of people you would like to send to this research school. So I will stop there, and thank you.
Before we have lunch, I just ask your patience for a bit. I'm pleased and honored to have in attendance at the workshop since yesterday, Alexander Pelyasov, who's one of the leading Russian economists dealing with the North. He is the director of the Center for Northern and Arctic Economies at the Russian Ministry of Economic Development. And in fact, he was involved when ReSDA first developed. That he and I were at a conference in Monaco in 2009 on climate change, where the indigenous representatives, it's not very often that I get to go to a conference in Monaco, but at that point, the indigenous representatives started to talk about the importance of knowing more about extractive industry on their communities. And so it's an honor to introduce for a few comments from Russia's perspective of ReSDA.
Introduction. It looks as if it were a different person. Well, thanks. It's really a pleasure to participate in your conference and to go back to early 90s when I was lucky chance to meet with brilliant regional economists of the state of Alaska, like Berman, Lichasky, and it was just like returning to the childhood years of my postdoctorate, being in Magadan, establishing this intellectual contacts with the state of Alaska and Institute of Social and Economic Research in Anchorage. I have dealt with mining several years, with gold mining in the far north of Russia, with the Dalstroy case, and so I would like to share in a very quick way some ideas on your presentations and on your project. It seems to me that there are two super goals in our research on mining, and all these super goals are connected with a new level of integration. The first super goal is, of course, to combine our knowledge on the natural resources with our knowledge on the social and social economic processes. This is a real challenge to show how the stage of natural resource cycles does influence on the social and economic dynamics on the level of communities, on the level of districts, and on the level of regions. We have made such a research on Khanty-Mansiysk Autonomous Okrug just now, this year, and we understood how remarkably differentiated communities and settlements with different stages of oil development life cycle deposits. And I am sure that in the gold mining and in the mining in general, Canadian mining is just the same. So it's necessary not only to look at the community impact of the mining activity, but the stage of assets, and how this stage of assets, which is direct consequences of the life cycle of this deposit, does influence on the social and economic dynamics in the community. That's the first challenge. And the second challenge is connected, of course, with this space and time integration, space-time organization of the mining activity on the local, regional, national level. It's a real challenge because, and I would like to tell some of my comments, when we look at the space-temporal organization of the Arctic mining in Russia and in Canada, in Arctic Canada, we immediately understood that there are huge differences because Russian Arctic mining is embedded into large urban settlements and cities, and just the opposite in Canadian case, it's embedded in small, far-flung rural settlements, rural communities. It's just the opposite. And the question is, what is the reason of such different space-temporal organizations of similar Arctic mining in two large federations, Russia and Canada? Is it the reason of political institutions, or maybe the kind of assets which mining in this or that case are dealing with, or something else? This is a real question. The difference of this space-temporal organization of the Arctic mining in two countries. We can call it in the very delicate way, as it's popular now, comparative institutional analysis of mining in the Arctic Russia and in the Arctic Canada. And having said this about these two super goals, I would like to tell some more details on your presentations. I'm sorry not to tell surnames, names, just a general picture, but maybe it will be of some help. Of course, in our European tradition, we are accustomed that each presentation are beginning with methodology to understand whom you are attached with. And it's strange for me that the majority of your presentations, they're connected with case-by-case surveys, but no this methodological foundation, like Danny Roderick works on the new industrial policy, which really is very helpful for you because it gives you the key to how to integrate social, economic, and mining activity in one paradigm. This new industrial policy is a tool to combine to create such integration. Of course, it's work by Norwegian dissident, economic dissident, Erik Reinert, with his speculations on the mining activity in the north and reindeer husbandry, etc. I met him, and it's really a great thinker who really can help you in your mining research in Arctic Canada. Well, maybe Karl Polanyi, Gunnar Myrdal, etc. Of course, it's necessary for us to understand that resource projects and resource industries are very peculiar, and so it's necessary to put this every time in mind. That's how it's peculiar from the processing and other activities. That's okay. I am very satisfied that there is a very strong knowledge component in your projects, in the majority of your projects. All kinds of knowledge spillovers, knowledge sharing with the communities, etc. And it seems to me that in general, the issue of communication, this is the big difference if we compare contemporary projects with the projects of my childhood, Alaskan childhood of early 90s, when there is no impetus of communication challenges in each Arctic project. Here, these 2 days, I understood that in each project, the issue of communication taken directly or indirectly was of critical importance. This is interesting, and it's really communication between participants of the project, communities, and actors. And one more thing, in all your presentations, the firm, the actor who did influence on the state of the local communities, etc., was like black box. It was like black box phenomena. No attempts to look at the structure of property, at the what corporation did this firm present. It was like black box attitude, black box approach. My suggestion is for the future that please do inside this black box of the firm and understood the structure of property, its economic behavior, its special behavior. This is very inspiring and provoking, and it does give you the key to understand the communication of this firm with the local community, because the structure of property gives us a lot of understanding to these issues. Yes, and yes, and what was interesting for me, I saw a sort of distribution of labor between Canadian universities, because Eastern universities, they prefer by proximity approach to deal with cases in the Eastern Arctic Canada, Western, and it's interesting how these partnerships, they are distinguished by geography, by proximity approach. These knowledge spillovers from the central Canada to the Arctic Canada and mining communities, they are totally dependent or inspired by the proximity principle. And of course, I do agree with you, Lee, and think that it's a great and it's a brilliant idea that we all are obliged to think how to strengthen linkages, internal linkages in the communities. It's not only necessary to think how to reduce linkages, external linkages from the community, financial, but how to increase the strength, the impact of the linkages which community can achieve, can take in its hands. This is, of course, very long-term strategy of strengthening of the local linkages. This looks like a PhD dissertation, at least, or maybe a monograph. So, but it's really a challenge, of course, for all of us dealing with Northern and Arctic issues. I was pleased to see that there are much more connections between Alaska and Northern Canada now than 25 years before, in early 90s. And this is very, very good news to mention. In my at the time of my childhood, Alaskan childhood, it was of course no connections or very rare, white horse or so. As a rule, Americans are very independent in their Alaska model of development. Now it's interesting that there are knowledge spillovers between neighbors, which is brilliant. What else? Of course, Francis told us yesterday about partnership. But let's go further. There is peculiarities of Arctic partnerships, Arctic economic partnerships, because of the spirit of cooperation in the Arctic communities, and it's necessary to study in particular this phenomenon of Arctic partnerships, not only partnership in itself, because they are very, very different from the partnerships in the, economic partnerships in the central Canada or central Russia, and etc. Yes, and finally, some comments on the Permanent Trust Fund and on the Alaska brilliant experience in this utilizing part of the oil wells in the interest of the future generations and so on. In 90s, the universal evaluation of this institution was, of course, that it's a real breakthrough in the world. and it's like benchmarking case for the rest. And I was very surprised to read at the Resource Clause book edited by Stiglitz that contemporary estimation of the Alaskan experience with this permanent trust fund is absolutely different. Absolutely different. It looks like to the authors, the majority of authors of this book, it's like much worse than Norwegian fund, and the idea to give a dividend for each household is totally a mistake, and it should be a community or more collective forms of redistribution of the oil rent. It's not my estimate, but it is interesting how in 20 years that universal, or maybe not universal, but the scientific evaluation of this innovative institution has changed totally. Let's think all about this. Again, thank you for your presentations. I really was very pleased and intellectually inspired and enriched by all your collective work in the interest of Canadian and global Arctic. And thank you, Chris, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. We will have lunch now. Lunch is out there. We won't have questions, unfortunately, but you will be able to, with your mouths full, ask questions of the various people during lunch. Did you get Kelly sauce? Pretty.